You guys are doing great. Bunch of romantics in the house. I mean, what better way to spend Valentine's Day than to study Ecclesiastes, the book that talks about love today, actually, in the passage that we're going to look at. I'm going to turn this down just a little bit for those in-house. So welcome. Good job keeping going with this. Usually we are really excited in the beginning of things and it's really easy, and then as things trudge on, it becomes harder and harder for us. But I'm looking at many faithful faces, and I'm sure people are sitting at home right now also faithful to what they set out to do, which was to spend time reading Ecclesiastes and understand the book better. And hopefully it's shifted some of the ways that you look at everyday life or some of the conversations that you've been having. I've had some conversations with some of you about how it just seems to come up in random conversations or where you find yourself applying Kohelet's wisdom to your everyday life. So that's awesome. That's like the whole point of this class, is that God's word, we would be so enthralled with God's word that it then permeate into our life. So just to start off, how was reading this week? We slowed way down, and all of a sudden we were going one chapter a day. Thumbs up, I've been doing all the reading every day. Thumbs down, I haven't been reading at all like this whole time, and then somewhere in the middle. Okay, great. So hopefully as you've slowed down, all the things that we've been talking about, you've been able to see them a lot easier, and you've spent time actually letting the words sink into what does this mean for me and my life and how I'm going to approach today. So that's really the hope of slowing down. We saw the forest, and now we're examining the trees in our reading plan and just looking at each one individually. Before we dive in, I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to get going. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for our friends and family that we can be surrounded by right now if we're here at the barn, or maybe we're sitting by someone at home watching this on the live stream. But even though we're not together physically, we are together spiritually, and we're going to spend time hearing from you, God. So we ask with humble hearts that you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear, and that you would show us how your word speaks to us here today in our life, in this moment, in this season. God, we need you. We love you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I grew up in Winston, Oregon, which is about an hour and a half south from here. And when I was a junior in high school, USC was playing U of O, and it was a great game. But the USC coach ended up giving me and some of the guys some tickets. Long story, I'm just going to leave it at that. But we were telling people that we were getting scouted. We totally weren't getting scouted. But the USC defense coach gave me and some friends some tickets. So we came up to Eugene. It was like my first time driving all the way to Eugene on my own with some friends. Took my dad's Mercedes, which that was a big risk in the first place. And we were up in Eugene, and I was familiar with some of Eugene because my parents sell tie-dyes at the Eugene Saturday Market, or at least that's what they did when I was growing up. And we watched the game, and I was familiar with downtown, and I knew that there was a place in Eugene called Sizzle Pie Pizza. So after the football game, I was like, guys, Riley, Jedi, my friend's name was Jedi. Okay, Riley, Jedi, we got to go to Sizzle Pie after this game. And they're like, all right, let's do it. So we left, and we pulled out of like the MLK, on the MLK, and we started driving. And I had no idea where I was going. And this was before I had an iPhone, so I couldn't map it or anything. And I'm pretty sure I got onto Pioneer Parkway somehow, but it was dark, it was foggy, and all I could see were the overhead lights. And I was like, where are we? And there was no other cars on the road, and I was just driving in the fog. This portion of Ecclesiastes that we're going to look at tonight is telling you that life feels like driving in the fog. Where you're like, I don't really know what's around the next bend or where I'm really going sometimes, but I know I'm driving, and I know I'm going straight on the road right now. Like, that's how it feels sometimes. So we're going to look at chapters 9 through the beginning of chapter 11. Let me just throw it up here. So remember, the big frame of Ecclesiastes, there's two voices. There's the words of Kohelet, which are verses, chapter 1, verse 12, all the way to chapter 12, verse 7. And those words of Kohelet, of the preacher or the teacher, whatever your translation says, they're being presented to us by a narrator. And the narrator tells us in chapter 12 that these words that we have just spent weeks hearing are words that are upright and true. These are true words that are upright, and they're good for us to hear, even though at times they hurt. And Kohelet looks out at this world, and he says, this is Hevel. And he's using a picture, a metaphor, hevel meaning smoke or vapor. And he's using this complex metaphor to say that life looks tangible, but then you try to grab it and it goes through your fingers. It's frustrating. It's elusive. Sometimes he just means that it's short. It's here one moment, then it's gone the next. And that's what we've been hearing. And throughout it, there is this gift, the gift of work, the gift of a good meal, and it's been building as we've been going through. It's been sprinkled throughout. Last week, we looked at chapter 7 through chapter 8, and we're going to pick it up today in chapter 9. There's a few sections that are in chapters 9 through the beginning of chapter 11 that we're going to look at. The first one is Kohelet's going to be talking about fate. What is the destiny of all of us? Well, there's a few things that he has to say about that. All of us have the fate of death, of time, and of chance. And we're going to see that. But there's also a gift of life. And in that section, it stands out from among the rest. And we'll see another one of these passages of the gift of God. Then he gives this little example of one of his observations. He calls it an example of wisdom, and he starts talking about this little city, this city that was besieged, but then it was rescued by someone who was wise. And he's starting to consider, is there actually a benefit of wisdom? Which leads us into chapter 10, and all of chapter 10 is lots of short proverbs again. So hopefully now, after last week, you have some of the skills to meditate on proverbs where they begin to come alive for you. So those proverbs all revolve around wisdom, folly, rulers, and of course, chance, because he brought that up in chapter 9. And then finally, we'll look at the beginning of chapter 11, which is living with the uncertainty of God's providence, or how I like to call it, driving in the fog. So all of this, from the beginning of chapter 9 all the way to the beginning of chapter 11, he keeps coming up with this idea of like, oh, you just don't know sometimes. And I like to think of it as driving through fog, when you really don't know where you're at sometimes, but you have the feeling that you're going in the right direction. Okay, so we're going to do what we always do. We're just going to start reading, and we're going to talk about it. So look with me at chapter 9, verse 1. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all. This is referring to what he had just been talking about, but really the entire book so far. So he was talking about the frustration of delayed justice. I laid this to heart and I examined it, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. This is a statement of God's sovereignty, and it sounds very positive at first, that God has all things in the palm of his hand. God is in control. Now, usually we would say that as a statement of comfort, but quickly, Kohelet does not use this as a statement of comfort. Look on what he says. He says, whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. So we would expect him to be giving some sort of like comfort by saying everything's in the hand of God. But then he says, you don't know whether it's love or hate, though, that you're going to get. And love and hate are strong words, and we shouldn't necessarily think of them as emotional words or emotive words. We should think of them as active words or action words. So when it's referring to God's hate, this is referring to God's wrath, his judgment, his reprobation, his decision to pass over some people. For example, Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, God says, I have loved you, says the Lord, but you say, how have you loved us? Is not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated. This is referring to God's decision to choose Jacob, not because of anything that he did, but because God chose to, and his decision not to choose Esau. And this is what Paul quotes in Romans 9. And this is actually using some language from Genesis 29, which is the story where Jacob wants Rachel to be his wife, but instead he gets Leah. So I'll just read it real quick. Jacob did so and completed her week. So he just got married to Leah. He got married to Leah, but he was tricked by Laban, his uncle. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah and served Laban for another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So the hate is that Jacob, he chooses Rachel, even though he has both. And that's where that language is coming from. But these aren't emphasizing emotion. It's emphasizing action and choice. So when we're in Ecclesiastes 9, he's saying, God has everything in control. And that's not always comforting because you don't know what he has for you in your future. You don't know where you stand. Other words we might use that would maybe be easier for us to understand would be God's blessing versus God's curse. Those are actions of God. So, being in God's hand isn't always a comforting sentiment. Sometimes it's terrifying. Sometimes it's terrifying. Everything is in God's hand, including your own life. That's not always comforting. Verse 2, it is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears is as he who shuns an oath. So he's saying all these people are the same. And what he's going to get on to say is they're the same because they die. But he's contrasting these things that are very familiar for a Torah reader, someone who reads their Bible, the first 5 books of their Bible especially. He contrasts the righteous and the wicked. He contrasts the one who sacrifices and the one who doesn't sacrifice. Throughout the Old Testament, the Levitical system, sacrifices was God's means through which he would bring reconciliation between him, a holy God, and humans who are sinful and wicked. And sacrifice was the method and the means of reconciliation. But he's saying, you know what? Sacrifice doesn't save you from death. You're still going to die. And making an oath, make the best oath you can, even keep it. You're still going to die. Look on at verse 3. He says, this is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. Again, he's talking about death here. Also, the hearts of the children of man are full of evil and madness in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. So he's not just reflecting on the fate of humankind, he's reflecting on humankind themselves. Kohelet's despairing right now. He is like in a state of lament, of sadness, of sorrow, of vexation. He's really frustrated by this, that it seems like you could be so righteous and someone could be so wicked and your destiny in this life is the same. You're going to die. And he's like, this is so frustrating. This is so frustrating. So he's in despair, but he's also despairing about humans themselves that were evil and that were wicked, and our hearts are set on doing bad. It kind of sounds like Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? This is what Kohelet's thinking about too. So he goes on in verse 4. So far, verse 1 through 3, he's like, man, life is tough because we're all going to die. And that's horrible. That all of us, our fate is death. But then he turns the corner. But he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. So he has these two proverbial statements. And he's trying to turn a corner and say, hey, but it's really good to be alive. Living is a gift. So the first thing he says is that the one who's joined with all the living has hope. Saying you have hope of a future when you're alive. In fact, you're like a living dog, better than a dead lion. And at first we're like, okay, that's a nice thing. Like the lion is really strong. Dogs are pretty strong and cute, and we would rather have a dog as a pet. So it's like, it's nice to be a dog instead of king of a jungle. Not really here in Ecclesiastes. So Dogs in the ancient Near East were associated with death. I think the Egyptian god is Anubis with like the dog head. He's a god of death. So dogs are associated often with death, and in the Jewish culture, they are an unclean animal. So here is Kohelet, a Jewish man, saying, you have hope if you're alive. You're like a dog. So he's saying that you're despised of all people. Lions, though, they are the king of the wild. They are mighty animals. But a dead lion can do nothing. But if you're living, that's nice, except for you're despised and you're associated with death. You're always in the shadow of death like a dog. Verse 5, for the living know that they will die. So here's him kind of explaining his little proverb. The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Now, when he says that the dead know nothing, he's not making a theological statement about our consciousness after we die. He's just contrasting, again, what he observes versus what he knows. And right now we're in one of the segments where he's talking about what he observes. And one thing is for sure. The moment you die, you cannot change your life. Can't change it. There is no amount of thinking, of production, of effort that you can exert when you die to change anything. How you die is how you die. Verse 6, their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. So all their emotions and all their choices, now all the things that drove their life before death, now that's done. There is no changing their life. Their portion in living is gone and done. Then it's a very hard turn. We get to verse 7, and it's a hard transition, and now we are in one of the passages on the gift of God. And if you notice, usually in the past sections, he would say, there is nothing better than that a man should, and he would say this observation, but now he has shifted to a command. He's actually telling you what is to be done and what is not to be done, rather than suggesting something. And all throughout the book, the gift of God passages have actually been growing in seriousness and in impact. So now he's not presenting a coping mechanism here with this horrible life that is in the shadow of death. Rather, he is giving a new or a different version of life to live in. So he says, go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Does this mean that God has approved whatever we plan to do? Anyone? What do you think? Shake your head, yes or no. Has God approved everything that you do? Okay, I heard some people, not a lot of head shakes. Okay, no worries. Okay, so it's not saying that everything you plan to do, God's already approved it. You know, if you're able to do it, that must have meant God planned it in the first place. That's not what he's saying. He's saying God has approved your eating and drinking. So the command, go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, that's the thing that he's talking about God approving of. God's already approved of you to eat and to drink and to find joy in your work. He's telling us that God's approved will is that we enjoy his basic provisions. God's approved will is that we enjoy his basic provisions. There's a couple new elements. He says, let your garment always be white. Your garments always be white. The color white often has to do with purity or with festivals or with elevated social status. So black would be like the color that you would wear to a funeral. White would be the color that you would wear to a party or a festival. And he's encouraging you to eat and to drink and to be joyful. And he's saying, clothe yourself in white. Take on a posture of joy. Let not oil be lacking from your head. Oil on the head is a mark of protection. So if you think of Psalm 23, the shepherd puts oil on the head of the sheep. That's to protect from the dry heat of of the ancient Near East landscape. It's really hot, it's really dry, your skin cracks. For another example, Isaiah 61:3. To grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of faint spirits, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. But the oil is associated with gladness. That's what I want you to see there. The oil is associated with gladness. So in this gift passage, he's encouraging them to take a posture of joy, to present yourself in a way that you are joyful about your position in life, the lot that you've been given, your daily portion, to enjoy it. Another new element, verse 9, enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain, your hevel, your short life that he has given you under the sun. Because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. So remember, the Kohelet, he is clearly meditating on Genesis throughout this book. Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, Genesis 4, right? Hevel, his name is Abel. And then Genesis 6 we saw last week. So he has scripture in his mind. He's been meditating on the creation narrative, Genesis 1 and 2, the ideal, and his command to find joy, to see good in your work and to eat and drink. He's saying, live as if you're in the garden. Live as if you're in the garden. And here again, when he's talking about enjoy your wife, he's reflecting on the Genesis 2 picture of man and woman delighting in each other, being made for each other in marriage. And so he's saying, if that's you, if you're married, enjoy it. And don't neglect your spouse. Don't neglect your spouse. Now he's not saying that you're like missing out and you've failed if you're not married. So don't think that you singles need to go out there and win the day tonight. But he says to do everything you can with all your might. Because this is what you've been given to work. Because the day that you die, you're not going to be able to do anything anymore. And again, he's not making a statement about whether or not you're conscious when you die. And when he says Sheol, he's just talking about the place of the dead. This isn't a word for hell. This is just referring to where the dead go when they die. And he says, you're going to go there. You're going to die. And you're not going to be able to change anything about your life once you're there. So, each day until then, work hard because that's what you've been given today. Enjoy a meal because that's God providing for you. Enjoy the company of a friend because that's a huge blessing and it's way better than being alone. Now he moves into, he keeps going through the fate of death, time, and chance. The last few words here. Again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift. He's like, I would think that Usain Bolt would win the race every time, but I've seen amazing athletes lose to PUDs. It's like, what? How are they winning? I've seen Tampa Bay win the Super Bowl. Like, if you said last season that Tampa Bay was going to win the Super Bowl this year, you'd be like, no, that's not going to happen. I've seen the race go to those who are not swift. And I've seen people win the battle even though they're not strong. I thought the strong person is supposed to win the fight. I've also seen the bread go to the people who were not wise. I thought the people who were wise were the ones who were supposed to prosper. And yet, the fool has become rich. I've also seen riches go to those who were stupid. How in the world did that person become so wealthy? It's bewildering. I've also seen favor not go to those with knowledge. I thought we're supposed to appreciate those who have knowledge, and yet we seem to despise those who have knowledge at times. But you know what he has seen happen to everyone? Time and chance. Time and chance happen to everyone. You are bound by the clock. There is nothing you can do about it. Every moment will keep ticking on, and you cannot change it. You cannot reclaim lost time. You can't do it. You sleep in too long. Think about this. To the person who sleeps till 9 a.m. every morning versus the person who wakes up at 5 a.m. every morning, even though they go to sleep at the same time, over the course of a week, that's 28 extra hours that the person who woke up at 5 a.m. lived. And the other person can never get it back. So time will happen to all of us. We will all grow older until we no longer grow. And chance happens to all of us too. And he's going to talk about that. These random occurrences that just seem to happen and go against all our understanding of conventional wisdom. And that's what a lot of the Proverbs are going to be about. For man does not know his time that he will die. Like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. So think about little fish. They're just like swimming along, just like, I'm having a great day with my school. And then all of a sudden, boom, net comes along, hoists them up out of the water. They're gasping for water, and then they die. And he's saying, that's what's going to happen to you. Do you think that the fish woke up in the morning from his little bed and then started swimming out? He's like, today I'm going to find myself in a net and die. No, he doesn't plan to die, nor does the bird plan to get snared by a net and then be killed. You can't plan your death. You don't know when it's going to happen. It's going to come for you quickly and suddenly, and you're not going to expect it. So what do you do in the meantime? How do you live this life if at any moment it could be your last? Friends, one of us could, God forbid, one of us could be driving home tonight and it could be over. And we don't even know that. So how do we live in the meantime? He's going to consider wisdom now for maybe how to navigate this. He says, I've seen an example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. It was awesome. There was this little city with a few men, just like a small little village. And then a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works. It's actually a similar word to net, just like the fish. So a strong, powerful king comes and besieges this small village. But there was found in it a poor, wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Poor wise man delivered this city from a great and powerful king. But no one remembered him. No one appreciated him or remembered him afterwards. But I say to you that wisdom is better than might. It would be, if you could choose between being wise or having a 405 bench press, choose wisdom. 405 on bench is a lot, just so we're all clear. He says choose wisdom. Wisdom is so much better than being strong. It will get you so much further in this world. Even though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. So he saves this town. And then people hate him afterwards. And they're like, get out of here. We don't want to hear it from you. So wisdom is really appreciated in the moment of crisis when it saves people. And then when everything starts calming down, they're like, we don't need you anymore. Things are fine. We got this. We'll take it from here. And they take over and they don't want to listen to the advice of the wise person. But he says, verse 17, the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. So this is a disparity that people don't want to listen to wisdom. And that there's many voices out there calling out, and you can hear a lot. But it's far better to seek out and to hear a wise person in quiet than to hear the shouts of the commander amongst a bunch of fools. He says wisdom is better than the weapons of war. Wisdom is far better than the weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. One rotten apple kind of ruins the bunch, doesn't it? So now, he's just going to think about wisdom. And he's going to give a ton of proverbs that consider wisdom, foolishness, rulers or government, and then, of course, chance, the thing that he's been talking about. These are really fun. I remember learning Proverbs for the first time, these were always really challenging for me until someone just started reading them with me and explaining them. So maybe for you guys, you're like, these are super easy. I don't know how you struggled with these. Or you were like, I used to be, where you're like, these are so hard to understand. So we're just going to explore some of them, and they're really fun. And remember, these are really dense sentences, 3 to 5 sentences, most of them, or 3 to 5 words per line. So they're really dense. And words have meanings. They have a plurality of meanings, but in a context, they have a meaning. So for example, an English word, the word green. What does green mean? Well, green is a color. I see some of you wearing green. Or I can say, I'm feeling a little green today, like meaning sick. The emoji for sick, it's a green face. Or if you went to the racetrack and you're like, who should we bet on? Just kidding, we're not. But who should we bet on? What about that horse? What about lucky number 7? Oh, you don't want lucky number 7. That's a green horse, meaning this is his first race. Or you can be at an intersection, and then someone in the back seat's like, hey, man, it's green, meaning go. So think about that. Or you could say, oh, I've made a lot of green this year, money. Or you can be like, you're trying to smoke some green. Hopefully no one's saying that in here, but you get the point. There's so many different meanings for the simple word green. So how do you know what it means? You know what it means by context. The context that a word is used in determines its meaning. So even though words have meanings, plural, in a context they have a meaning. When it comes to Hebrew poetry, because they're such dense sentences of 3 to 5 words, it means there's many possibilities of the meanings because there's limited context. So, for example, this very first one. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Before we talk about what it means, when it says dead flies, it is the word dead and flies, but this combination could mean that these flies are dead, or it could mean that these are poisonous or deadly flies. Either way, they're either dead or they're deadly, and they're flies. And then he says a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. When it says outweighs, it's actually the word for precious. He's saying a little folly is more precious than wisdom and honor, or it has more value than wisdom and honor. So our translation is just helping us understand what that means. To say it has more value means it has more weight to it. Like if you have a more valuable reputation, you have more weight to your name than someone else. So that's just some of the nuances. Those are really fun. But what does this actually mean here? You have this really expensive ointment. I mean, you paid a lot of money, maybe 10 denarii. You get it, and it smells so good. I mean, someone made this for like 3 years, purifying and squeezing this oil, and you buy it, and you're going to gift it for Valentine's Day to your beloved, and then a little fly falls in it, and you're like, oh no, and you try to get it out, and it starts sinking to the bottom, and then it just smells putrid. You spent so much money on this, and it smells horrible. Such a small little fly ruined your precious ointment. So also, just a little bit of foolishness. A little bit of foolishness has the ability to ruin all your wisdom and honor that you have. You think you're wise and honorable? Make one mistake and see what happens. The culture will cancel you immediately, at least in our culture, or your reputation will be tarnished. That's the power of one foolish act. Verse 2, a wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. In conventional wisdom, wisdom is a guide. It's something that guides you through life. So he's saying wisdom will guide you to the right, but foolishness is not a guide, it's a prankster and takes you in literally the opposite direction. That's how much of a disparity there is. They take you in different directions. Verse 3, but even when a fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. So he says, a wise person goes to the right. The fool goes to the left. But sometimes there's a fool who's just like walking to the right. And you're like, wait a second. But he's walking like such a goofball. You're like, that's a fool right there. You can see him from a mile away. So he's saying foolishness, even when it seems like the fool is doing the right thing, they're easy to spot. Just something about them. Like you recognize it when you see it. I like that one. It's funny. Verse 4, if the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offense to rest. So this is actually a little different than what he said earlier in the book. Let me jump to it. Let's see, where are we? In chapter 8, verse 2 and 3, he says, I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? So there he's saying, don't flee really fast, but don't stand in the presence of the king if he's angry with you. You should get out of there because he's going to destroy you. But here in chapter 10, he says, if the ruler gets really angry with you, don't go away, because then it's going to look like you did something wrong. It's going to incriminate you if you try and flee the scene. But instead, stay really calm. Because calmness, when someone's yelling at you and you're like, oh, are you sure you're upset? It just kind of defuses them. Like, what's going on? Why aren't you mad? You're like, I don't know what's wrong with you in this moment. You talk real monotone. So you're saying calmness, being mellow, that will lay great offense to rest. That will appease their anger. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were, an error proceeded from the ruler. This term error here, it's the same term used in Leviticus 5:18 to talk about the sin of inadvertence. It's like an unintentional sin, or a sin that you didn't know you were necessarily committing. So that's what he's talking about when he says an error. So this mistake leads to all these implications. The sin leads to implications. Verse 6 and 7. He says, folly, or like a foolish person, is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses, and princes walking on the ground like slaves. So he's saying that if the ruler makes an error, he makes a sin of inadvertence, he makes a mistake, it has this ripple effect where all of a sudden it flips what should be upside down. The mistake of one person can turn our world upside down, where all of a sudden the people you would expect to be in the position of power are not. And notice he flips out the rich for a wise. So he says folly is set in many high places. Then you would expect him to talk about the wise person. But instead he says the rich are in the low places. This is the same thing that leads to the race not going to the swift, or the battle not going to the strong. So it kind of changes verse 4, because if the anger of the ruler that rises against you, if they're making a mistake in the moment, then you probably shouldn't listen to that proverb anymore. So all of these, they kind of have a tension between each other to where you're not really sure what to make of it. Sometimes a proverb applies to your situation. Other times, it doesn't. It takes wisdom to know what proverb to apply and when. Now he's going to talk about chance. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries a stone is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. So this first line, he who digs a pit will fall into it. This is actually a really common thought throughout the Old Testament. I'm going to go to a ton of examples, and you can write them down in your notes, but we'll read them together. So the first one is Proverbs 26:27. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. So this guy digging a pit, he's like, I'm going to trap some people. Or he's pushing a stone, he's going to start rolling to take some people out. He wants to cause harm to someone, and it says the person who intends harm for someone, their consequence will be the very thing that they wanted to bring upon someone else. Psalm 7:15 and 16. He makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole that he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own skull his violence descends. So again, what he intended to use to harm someone else is actually the consequence that he faces. This is retribution principle. This is character and consequence. Psalm 9, verse 15 and 16. The nations have sunk in the pit that they made, in the net that they hid. Their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. Psalm 35, 7 and 8. For without cause they hide their net for me. Without cause they dug a pit for my life. Let destruction come upon him when he does not know it, and let the net that he hid ensnare him. Let him fall into it, to his destruction. One more, Psalm 57, 6. They set a net for my steps, but my soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. So all throughout the Old Testament, there's this idea that there is going to be an equal consequence for someone's character, or retributive justice, meaning what you do will reap the consequence. So do good, get good. Do bad, get bad. And here it's painting this picture that the one who intends to harm someone, the very means by which they wanted to use to harm someone is actually going to be the justice that's brought upon them. And that's how Ecclesiastes here in Kohelet, his own words, he's starting off with that. The one who digs a pit falls into it. A serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. This is the idea of like breaking through a wall to steal and rob things, but the way walls were constructed in the ancient Near East and Israel, the mortar that they would use for the walls, when they would begin to crack in the sun, they'd make these like little crevices that would be great homes for snakes. So in their attempt to like break in and steal, they actually end up getting bit by a little serpent. Then he switches it on its head, and he totally turns the corner. He who quarries stones is hurt by them. So notice that he's quarrying stones. He's not like rolling a stone down a hill to hurt someone. This is someone doing honest labor. Like they're just doing honest labor, they're at their job, and then all of a sudden, they have a serious accident. Machine breaks, rope snaps, tree falls, stone falls back on them. It's just an accident at the workplace, and this person gets seriously hurt. And he also says, he who splits logs is endangered by them. Just doing honest work, you want to provide some heat for your family, you're splitting logs, all of a sudden, boom, splinter, into the eye, blind. Or the axe head slips and you nick your shin, and there's no emergency room down the road, so instead it just gets infected, and then you have like the local medicine guy come over, he's like, well, we're just going to try and cut it off. And you're like, okay, he cuts it off. And they die. All just because he was like out providing some firewood for his family. Random chance. Those are two examples of how you could get hurt cutting wood. There are so many more examples. You're just doing honest labor and you get hurt. So on one hand, someone intends harm for someone, well, that comes back on them. But then also someone's just doing a really good, decent thing. They're just working hard and they get hurt. Both happen. Chance can happen to all of us. So what's the point of these two little lines here? It only takes one unpredictable and uncontrollable accident to shatter traditional wisdom. It only takes one. Any such accident means that life is unpredictable. It is not a one-to-one correlation of what you do to what you receive. Life is unpredictable. It's an enigma. It's frustrating. It's elusive. It's hevel. Like, man, why do bad things happen to good people? Kohelet says it's chance. So somehow the way we perceive of chance plays into God's plan and everything he holds in his hand. He keeps thinking about work. If the iron is blunt, and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. This is a great little proverb if you wanted to memorize it. There is success in wise preparation. You want to go cut down a tree? It's going to be way easier and way quicker if you use good tools. So sharpen your axe. Sharpen your saw, whatever you're going to use to do it. Sharpen your mind, whatever tool you're going to use to accomplish a task. Don't just go out there with like a mule mentality, like I'm just going to muscle it down, and you're out there for like 3 hours chomping on a tree when it could have taken you an hour and a half and way less energy. So just to push it into like your life, you guys all have an axe that you use. Maybe it's your mind at your job. Maybe it's a manual labor job. Maybe for those of you who like serve in one of the bands at the church, you have skills. You have to sharpen your skills, sharpen your tools in order to be successful without exerting tons of energy. So it's well worth it to take an hour every day to sharpen your saw or to sharpen your axe, whatever that might be for you. For many of us, we all use our mind in many capacities, so sharpen it. Don't just go about your day like full head of steam saying, I'm just going to conquer this day one task at a time. Take the time to sharpen your tools. So there is success in wise preparation, but even wise preparation, it can't account for the random danger of splitting wood or the misfortune that could happen before work even begins. Look at the next one. If a serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. So there's this like skilled snake charmer down at the marketplace. He's like, gather around everyone. The snake is about to come out. And he gets his flute out. And he's like, all right, go ahead and take the lid off. And he takes the lid off and the snake starts coming out. And he's like, and the snake bites him before he even starts playing. Couldn't have planned on that one. Like maybe he's like a really good snake charmer, but it got to him before he even started working. So you can plan so much, and you can be so skilled and so wise, and yet an occurrence can happen that stops you before your work even begins. So there's success in wise preparation. Misfortunes do happen when you work. And also, you can never plan against the unseen things that could happen before you begin. You could be just driving to work, and then something happens. You could be at work, you did the entire safety check, and a freak accident could happen. But you should still be wise, because being wise will lead you to more successful work. Verse 12, the words of the wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. You guys like being around people who are really gracious to you, like kind to you? Yeah, the wise man's lips, his mouth, wins him grace. People appreciate it when you are wise and kind to them. But a fool, man, they start talking, all of a sudden they're putting their foot in their mouth, they're making a scene. People are like, ooh, I hope he's not saying that again. There is a guy that I know, love him to death, awesome. And he just says the wrong things at the wrong time all the time. It's super funny and enjoyable, like in hindsight, but in the moment, it makes the entire room awkward. Like he always takes the joke a little too far, and his lips consume him. It just destroys him in his tracks. So, are you a man or a woman of wise mouth, or are you one with foolish lips? The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolish, and the end of his talk is evil madness. This is talking about the fool's words. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolish, and the end of his talk is evil madness. So the fool's words are always developing and also always deteriorating. It's just like they just keep talking, and that's what he begins to talk about next. Verse 14, a fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? So he's like, a mark of a fool? They never know when to shut up. This is me being Kohelet here. It's just like they just never shut up. They just keep talking. Like, man, will that guy please be quiet? He was so offensive. Why did he keep doing that? Why is she like that? Why does she never stop talking? And they talk so much that they then start contradicting themselves, putting their foot in their mouths, offending people. And it's just, man, if we could teach that person one thing, it's just like, just stop talking. Stop talking. But then he says, but no one knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? So it's like, we all have sat in the room where we're like, that person's a fool and don't know what they're talking about. But then he turns it on you and he says, how do you actually know that they don't know? You don't know what's going to happen. You don't actually know what's going to happen. So don't be so quick to think that person is a fool, because how do you even know what's going to happen? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Sometimes we seem to pride the hard work or the work ethic. The person who just won't stop working. They work so hard, man. They're working 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week. They just keep going. And they're like, wow, that person's amazing. But according to Kohelet, that person's a fool. They just work all the time and they're just tired from all their work. That's like someone who doesn't know how to find their way back to the city. Like you're out in Coburg and you're like, how do I get to Eugene again? It's like, didn't you just come from the city? Now you don't know how to get back? That's basically what you're doing when you just work really hard and you never stop and you run yourself into the ground. Woe to the land when your king is a child and your princes or your commanders feast in the morning. So now he's talking about rulers again. He says, this is a dangerous spot for your community, for your city, for your nation, when you have an immature ruler and you have commanders who, rather than working during the day, they're getting drunk and throwing bashes with the boys. Like, man, the land is going to suffer miserably. The country is going to suffer miserably. But happy or blessed, this is the same word for blessed, is the man in Psalm 1. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility and your princes, again, your commanders feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. The entire community, city, state, country benefits when the person who is in charge has noble character. When they are noble and they're in the position that they should be, as a son of nobility. And when the commanders wake up in the morning and they work, and then they feast at the proper time, but they're not just throwing parties to get blackout drunk with the boys. Like they're like, hey, we accomplished our task today. Let's have a meal together. Cheers. Let's toast. And then the next day they wake up and they do it again. So, I mean, which camp do you think you find yourself in more often than not? And you don't have to be getting drunk to be a fool here. But maybe just not being diligent with the work that you've been given each day. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. Anyone have home projects that they need to work on? And they just kind of let it sit for a while, and it gets worse and worse and worse. We're in a rental. So I'm always having this ethical dilemma about how much I should care for the yard. It's like, should I really care for it? Should I not care for it? So I go through waves and seasons where I have a push mower and I'll be out there just grunting it out, and I have a weed whacker that'll go and take everything out and I'll line the edges. And then I have seasons where our place looks like a jungle, and it is so hard to fix it when it gets out of control. It is so hard. When you become slothful in the task at hand, you have that little corner in your room with the dirty laundry, and you're like, I should do the laundry tomorrow night. And then tomorrow night is all of a sudden next Sunday, and it's a huge pile, and you're like, oh my gosh. And then you find yourself doing laundry all day because it takes you 4 loads to get through it all. And then you just have this huge basket of laundry, and you put it in your bedroom. You're like, all right, I'm going to fold that tomorrow when I get home from work. And then it just sits there for 2 weeks, and every morning you wake up and you just pull some clothes out, and then next thing you know, your clothes are wrinkly, so you have to wash them again. Slothfulness allows your roof to sink in. And through indolence, or just a lack of care, the house leaks. Are you being diligent in the task that's at hand for you? Or have you been slothful? I know this one convicts me, so we're all in this together. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Whoa, that one came out of nowhere, right? All right, money answers everything. Okay, so what is he saying here in verse 19? So he's talking more about like the festival, that bread is made for like bread and wine, good food, good drink. I mean, that's made for celebration. Like that's why we have it. It's for joy. It's for celebration. It's for gladness of our hearts. It's for the company. And you know how you have bread and wine? Money. You don't get that stuff if you don't have money. How many of you put food on your table without money? You all have food because of money. Saying money is the answer to everything. So all these proverbs start working together. You're like, okay, well, hold on. If like the bread and the wine and the money is the thing, then maybe those first rulers who are waking up first thing in the morning, they're like, let's party, boys, and they're cracking a cold one. It's like maybe they had it all figured out. So you just have to, each one that you get to, it sends you back into all of them, and you start reconsidering all of these proverbs. But what this isn't saying is it's not saying that the answer to everything is money. It's not saying that the answer to everything is money, but rather that money gives an answer to everything. Money is the answer to everything. It gives an answer. It is able to answer all circumstances if you have money. But there are things that come when, if you don't have money, you cannot give an answer. So money is something that you want to acquire for yourself, at least from that proverb. So then verse 20, the way you acquire or maintain money is by staying in good favor with whoever is in charge. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. So he's saying don't risk it for the biscuit. Don't take a chance thinking you're in private. Because even when you think you're alone, someone's listening, and they will rat you out. And just a little bit of foolishness is enough to ruin precious ointment of your reputation and your wisdom. So he's saying, don't even think it. Just don't even think it. All right, last 6 verses that we're going to look at. Life is uncertain, but everything is in God's hand. God is sovereign over all things, meaning God has all control, all power over all things for all time. There's not a single thing outside of God's control. And in God's providence, God is working out all things for his purposes. It's just we're really uncertain with how everything is going about. It's like we're in the fog, even though we know that there's a road that's leading to Sizzle Pie Pizza or wherever you're trying to get to. So living with uncertainty of God's providence. First, jump actually to verse 6, because this is going to be the interpretive key for all of it. Verse 6, the very last end of it. He says, withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. So this is the key for the section we're about to read. But simply put, you don't know what God has planned for the future. You do not know. And if we don't know what will happen, how should we live? And these 6 verses are getting to like the practical. What do you do with your life right now? Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. So it's like, okay, cool. The wisdom is to go down to the bird pond and to throw some bread to the ducks. That's not what this is about. I'm just kidding. This one gives interpreters a hard time. There's like 3 possibilities. I'll give you the one that most agree on. But that he's talking about investment. You know, we have the term, bring home the bread or bring home the bacon. Bread being used about money or finances. And to cast your bread or your resources upon the waters, referring to the ship trading that was starting to take place in the ancient Near East. So he's saying, put your resources on the ship trading, for you will find it after many days. And this is, you might find it after many days, meaning take the risk and invest, and it might return a reward for you. So you don't just like store it up, but instead invest and send it out because some of it might come back to you. Verse 2, give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. So now, again, thinking of your finances, your resources, he turns from investment, likely turning towards generosity. What should you do with what you have? Man, just like give it to people. Give it to 7 people. Give it to 8 people. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what disaster might happen on earth. We might not have tomorrow. When was the last time you had someone over for a meal and you like went to the grocery store and you bought like $60 worth of food and you just like served someone? Maybe it was a really long time ago. Maybe it hasn't happened, but why don't we do that? Well, it's like, oh man, $60. So like I should save that. He's saying, you might not have tomorrow. You should be really generous with what you have. Buy people meals. Bring people into your house and serve them dinner. Take them out to coffee. Invest in the people around you. Not just 7 people, even 8 people. So whatever number you think would be like, oh, that's a good amount of people to start investing in, he says, up it by 1. Do more than what you think. So what should you do with your money? Invest in what could bring back profit, but you don't know, but also invest in people. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Profound wisdom from Kohelet. If a tree falls, there it lies. Okay, so he's saying some things just happen, and you can't change them. A cloud that's full of rain, it's going to empty itself. A rain cloud's going to rain. And when a tree falls, the spot where it falls, like that's where it's at. You can't change that. If it's falling to the south, it's going to fall in the south. There's nothing you do that changes those circumstances. But we are always trying to determine them or control them. So he says, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. So he's talking about what you have in your possession as resources. What do you do with it? There's some farmers, think about this farming analogy he's using. You have tons of seed and you're waiting to go and like to sow it, to throw it. Think about the parable of the sower who just throws it everywhere and doesn't even care where it's going. He says, some will observe the wind and will not sow. They'll just be like, not today, Charlie. It's just the wind's not right. It's going to go to the rocky soil. We don't want to do it today. And they just keep delaying to the point where they never actually sow, and then they miss the season to sow, and then they miss the harvest. Because they're so caught up what if it fails? What if it doesn't work? What if it fails? Have there been things that you didn't do because you were afraid it would fail? That you've been in a state of paralysis because the idea of it failing kept you from actually trying? The other thing he says is, he who regards the clouds will not reap. So maybe you did sow and your plants did grow and there's a harvest out there waiting, and you're going to go out and you're going to reap it. You're going to cut it down and you're going to gather the harvest. But you keep looking out and you're like, those clouds are pretty dark. Like, I don't know. Like, maybe we should wait. I am not a farmer at all. Ask Brad. He was. But I do remember hay season in the summer. I would buck hay. And we would watch the clouds. It was like, if you do not want to cut your hay if it's about to rain, because once you cut it and it rains, then it gets moldy and it ruins all of it. But if it rains while it's still in the ground and growing, it'll have time to dry out. So it's like the day that you cut it, you are baling that and you are getting it in before it ever rains. So if you're always hesitant about the rain, you'll never actually cut it down because you're afraid it'll start raining after you cut it, and then it'll get moldy and it'll ruin your crop. But again, he's saying there is this paralysis where you just don't act because you're scared of a failed venture. You're so afraid of it failing that you don't even try. I mean, how many of us could say that about a work situation, or about a friend situation, or about an evangelism situation? I really want to share the gospel with them, but I'm so afraid of it failing that I don't even try. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning, here's Kohelet's advice to you. In the morning, sow your seed, and at evening, withhold not your hand, for you don't know which will prosper. So he's saying, hey, wake up in the morning and sow. Sow the seed, work. And also in the evening, you should also work, because you don't know which seed's actually going to grow. God's going to determine which one it grows, but no seed will grow if no seed is planted. In 1 Corinthians 3, this is talking about spiritual growth and about evangelism. And there's bickering in the Corinthian church where they're starting to divide amongst each other. And some of them are like, well, we follow Apollos, and Apollos is a great preacher, like one of the best preachers ever. And others were like, well, we follow Paul, and Paul is an apostle, so we're better than you Apollo boys. And then there's others like debating about like who they got baptized by. And Paul says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believe, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. You don't know which one God is going to make grow. In your evangelism of telling people that Jesus has lived and conquered sin and death for them, and that through faith in Jesus they can be liberated from slavery and bondage to sin and have eternal life with God, all the way down to you taking your money and saying, I'm going to buy someone a meal, and I'm going to invest my money in the community, and maybe I'll see a reward for it, and maybe I won't. Who knows what will happen? God does, and God is the one who gives growth, but he doesn't make anything grow if nothing is planted. So, this is Kohelet's wisdom for you this week and the rest of your life. It feels like we're driving in a fog sometimes, and we live with uncertainty, but we also live under the providence of God, where he is in control and he is sovereign and all things are in his hand. So even though we can't see clearly, we should trust God and we should work hard. Or as Paul says elsewhere, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Or again in 1 Corinthians 10. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all for the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So work hard, because you don't know what's going to prosper. Let me pray for us, and then I'll let some of you guys go, and others will stick around. Father, thank you for this evening to consider your word. Thank you that you constantly bring us back to the foot of the cross, where at times we do not understand things, but we can hold on to the one who is in control. Jesus, you are the yes and amen of all the promises of God. And many times in our lives we have been scared and afraid because we are afraid of failing. We've been so afraid and scared that we haven't even acted. God, I pray for all of us in this room that you, by the power of your Spirit, would encourage us and strengthen us to be able to move forward in our day-to-day life, trusting you, knowing that all of our resources come from you and you've given them to us to use and benefit others. God, they're not ours to own, they're ours to use. So God, give us eyes to see the ways that you want us to be working in our everyday life, not withholding our hand from what you give. and not delaying to act, knowing that you will make grow what you have chosen to. God, we love you and we need you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we're going to take a little break. Some of you guys can leave, and then others will stick around, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes for those online. Your reading or about what we talked about or anything else, open floor, and I'll do my best to repeat the questions. Yeah.
I had one. Right when you started in chapter 9:9,
Mm-hmm.
there in Ecclesiastes, we were comparing hate versus love,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then later on, you very profoundly talked about how different words have different connotations, right? Green can mean a million things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking the same thing about hate,
Mm.
right? And as we understand the word hate, right, that when that word, I'm just trying to grasp the meaning of that word in that context there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is on the word hate and its semantic range. So that's the fancy term for its possibility of meanings, of how many different meanings could a single word have. So when we're talking about green, green has like so many meanings. It has a large semantic range. Other words, though, have a very limited or narrow semantic range to where they only have one or two variations of what they mean. And I can, for those of you who are here, I can actually show you something. Let me see if I can do it on here. So let's see. Open in floating window. Oh, yeah. Wait for it. Oh, what's happening? This is not what I wanted. It's not actually working. Basically, the word that is used in Hebrew for hate, it's the word sinha or sinah. It has a very narrow semantic range. In our English, our word hate actually conveys what it means very well. So in our English, the word hate has a variation of what it is implying. It can be an emotion, or it can be an action. You can hate a verb towards someone, or you can have a feeling towards someone. So at least here, it have a very wide range. Does that answer the question about that? Does it make sense? Yeah, so the other way we would understand...
Where somebody does something well and then God hates the other person. I think that's how the context is being used there. God hates the person who doesn't perform as well as the other person. He loves the one person. I think it's 9:9. Try 9:9.
Oh, 9:9. 9:9 says, enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Afterwards, he does talk about the people who die, and it talks about how their love and their hate is no more. But again, it's doing a play on 9:1, so God's choice to show favor to some and not show favor to others. So also we make those decisions all the time. We have loves, we have hates. For example, I grew up drinking Coca-Cola. Ayo, shout out, anyone? And is anyone a Pepsi person? Okay, one Pepsi guy. Welcome, get out. Just kidding. Okay, do I have an emotional hate for Pepsi? No. But would I say, if someone gave me the options, like, hey, you want Coke or Pepsi? I'd be like, oh, I hate Pepsi. I love Coke. Like, talking about my choice in that matter. So these words, usually how we then understand words in the Bible is we look at all the occurrences of the word throughout the Bible, and we see how they're used in each context, and the context of all of them help us understand their semantic range. So it's really nerdy stuff, but once you just start looking at it, it's really helpful. But yeah, good question. I'm not sure I totally answered it though for you. Walla.
I was just thinking of when Jesus talks about those unworthy of being a disciple, they don't hate their own family.
Oh yeah, great.
It's like when I've heard that, that's the only time I've heard your description.
Mm-hmm.
When it's like, it's not you hate them, but you choose to follow one or the other.
Yes. Yeah, so Walla brought up when Jesus says, if you do not hate your father and mother, then you are not my disciples. We're talking about the division that happens between Jesus and his followers and the rest of the world. So he'll say things like, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. But he's not actually telling people, I want you to viscerally hate your dad. That's not what Jesus means. He means you need to choose me over your father if he tells you not to choose me. And that separates families, when people choose Jesus over their loved ones. Yes?
Would you say that Kohelet believes in karma?
Great question. The question is, do you think Kohelet believes in karma? So there is karma in the Hindu religion, and then there's karma in Western culture. Western culture, karma is usually just like, oh, you do a little bad thing, that same little bad thing happens. And it's kind of a reduced version of karma in Hinduism. In Hinduism, your life that you are living and all of your past lives have been acquiring some karma level of good and of bad, and this is determined based off of your dharma, like your situation in life of which you are supposed to live. So if you have been born to be a manual laborer, you fulfill your dharma by doing that task. Or if you've been born to be a priest, you fulfill that task, and it looks a lot different than the other person. And that kind of determines how much karma you are elevating and not elevating, and then that will determine if you are reincarnated at a higher caste system or a lower caste system. So that's a much more complex thing than what Kohelet is talking about. Kohelet is talking about the Retribution Principle. And this is present in the Old Testament. Think of the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 27 through 29, or 26 through 29, is the blessings and the curses of obedience or disobedience to the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant. So God makes a covenant with the nation of Israel, and he says, if you obey my voice, here's the blessings that will happen. if you disobey my voice and disobey my command, here are the curses that will happen. And they get worse and worse and worse in their disobedience until finally the curse in Deuteronomy 29 and 30 is that they'll be exiled from the land. But God says, but if at any moment when you're scattered amongst the nations, if you repent and turn back, I'll bring you home. So that really is an action-consequence relationship. Same thing in Proverbs, where there really are things that if you do it, there is a consequence. So on one level, there is an action-consequence correlation in our world. I would be willing to bet if you walked up to 10 people on the street and slapped them, they would fight you all of a sudden. Maybe 1 out of the 10 would be like, why did you do that? And they wouldn't hit you back. But there is a natural action-consequence correlation. Karma is saying that there is an absolute correlation to action, while Kohelet is talking more about the retribution principle in everyday life. So things like being successful and prospering in the land. That was one of the blessings in the Old Covenant, is if they would listen to the voice of the Lord, their land would prosper and there would be big harvest each year. And of course, this was if they kept Sabbath and gave the land a rest every 7 years from working it. And they didn't do any of that stuff, so they never reaped the blessings. Jesus was obedient to the Old Covenant. He fulfills that, and in so doing, he is righteous in our place. So when we place our faith in Jesus, the blessings of the Old Covenant, all of the promises find their yes in Christ for his people, that we will finally enjoy in full in the new creation. So it is different than karma, but the way you think of karma is probably similar to how he's talking about it. Yeah, good question. Long answer. Yes.
So he uses the term grievous evil
Mm-hmm.
or just evil a lot. Typically, what does that mean?
Yeah, the question is, what does grievous evil or evil mean in the book? So we have both the blessings and the curses of Greek philosophy and then modernity. So when we hear evil, we have a very narrow scope of what evil means. We think of moral evil, something being opposed to God's good moral character. So scholars, they parse these out a little bit. So there's primary evil and then there's secondary evil. Primary evil would be the opposition to God's good or the absence of goodness. That's what sin is. But then there's secondary evil, which is the consequences of that bad thing. So, for example, there are earthquakes that destroy homes. And what Paul says in Romans 8 is that the entire creation is subjected to futility. It's actually the Greek word that's used for hevel in Ecclesiastes. So this is the world is subjected to futility, meaning it's bound by a corrupting decay because of that evil sin, that moral evil. But there is a natural evil. So he's referring to just bad situations. Bad would actually probably be a better word for us to think of when we read evil. He's saying this is just not good. This is bad. But he's not talking about morality there. Does that make sense? Cool. Awesome. Good question. That's really good. Other questions? All right, well, what do you guys think? In Ecclesiastes 9:2, when he makes all those contrasts of the righteous and the wicked, the good and the evil, the clean and the unclean, the one who sacrifices, the one who doesn't sacrifice, the one who's good and the sinner, he's showing that he has a really clear understanding of Torah, which at times there's been scholars who have been like, oh, the wisdom tradition is totally separate from the law tradition. So they would separate Torah or law and then wisdom tradition and say, yeah, they use similar words, but they don't have the same semantic meaning when they're using them. And they kind of separate them. But throughout the book, Kohelet has quoted from Deuteronomy. He's clearly aware of Leviticus. Leviticus 1 through 17 deals with sacrifice and with clean and unclean things. So like he's like clearly aware of these. He's seeing them not as separate traditions of like, oh, we have Torah over here, and then we have wisdom over here. We have Torah and wisdom. And actually, when you get to the book of Deuteronomy, God keeps calling through Moses as he's giving the final speech before they go into the land, keeps saying that his commands will be Israel's wisdom, that his Torah, his instruction is wisdom. So Kohelet clearly understood Torah, and he sees Torah and wisdom as being united, not separated. So if you ever hear someone say, wisdom is different than Torah, Torah is different than wisdom, they're unrelated, just be like, cool. But just know that they are related and they go together. Yeah, well,
I think you might talk about it last week or something, but I'm still not fully clear on it. But when we talk about shadow, it's not a negative thing when you're in like past life, like a shadow. But you also talked about like the shadow is like a protection,
mm-hmm.
and so I've only seen it as it's darkness, so it's bad, it's opposite of light. But I was curious if you could show more examples of shadow as a positive thing, or maybe it's also the context of when it's used.
Yeah, so the question on the word shadow, it kind of sounds like a negative thing, but sometimes it seems to be used positive. So you're right. Usually when it's a positive thing, your translator doesn't translate it as shadow because it has, in our culture, a negative connotation. So most of the time when shadow does appear in the Hebrew language, you don't see it in English just because we have that negative connotation. So there was the proverb that we looked at last week, which actually was saying that being in the shadow of money is like being in the shadow of wisdom. But they translate it as like the protection because that's what it is talking about. It's the protection, the preservation. But in the first person in the Bible who is called wise, anyone? Anyone know who it is? It's a guy named Bezalel. Yeah, it's a cool name. I'm trying to find the... So in Exodus 31, if you need like a kid's name, here we go. Exodus 31:2. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have called by name Bezalel," which means in the shadow of God. That's like what his name means. "The son of Uri, the son of Hur, from the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God and ability." This word ability here is the Hebrew word chokhmah, which is what we translate most often as wisdom. He's filled with the Spirit of God. He has wisdom and intelligence, knowledge and craftsmanship to devise artistic designs and work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stone for setting, and in carved wood and work in every craft. This is the first wise person in the Bible, and he is someone who is a craftsman, and he decorates the tabernacle. So think about, like, for those of you who like do crafts with your hands, you're operating wisdom when you do that. And so this first guy, Bezalel, in the shadow of God, he's an artist, and he's wise. So that's what he is. So that's a good thing there, to be in the shadow of God, be in the protection of God. We have time for like one more question. Okay.
Just on the word Sheol,
Mm-hmm.
the afterlife,
Mm-hmm.
that at the time that this book was written,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus hadn't come yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then there were revelations that came after Jesus about heaven and, things, judgment, the book of life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those things were not known to Solomon or whoever drafted Ecclesiastes. And I'm just wondering
Yes. The question is on the word Sheol. Where do you go when you die? What was their understanding? Because they all seem to use this. If you did just a concordant search, a word study, Sheol just refers to the place where people go when they die. We're actually planning on doing another class starting 2 weeks after this one, if all things go well, and we're going to do it on the book of Ephesians. And we'll have an entire day where we talk about this because it talks about Jesus descending. So the question is, what is Sheol? So here's the 3-minute answer. In the Old Testament, both the righteous and the unrighteous go to Sheol. And it is divided. There's the side of Abraham, and there is the side of the wicked. And they are divided, and there is a division between them. This was an understanding in the Jewish concept, and you can see it when Jesus tells the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where Lazarus dies, and he's on the side of Abraham, or it's called Abraham's bosom, just meaning his side. And across the way, he can see the rich man. The rich man is like, Lazarus, please dip your finger in water and touch my tongue. So they can see each other. But there is this disparity and separation. Now, that was the place where the dead would go, both the righteous and the unrighteous, and there was a different quality and experience for both of them, as we can tell in that parable and other texts. But once Jesus dies, part of what he is doing in his death and his burial and then his resurrection is he is actually gathering the saints of old who were waiting to be united to God. And he takes them with him as he ascends to the right hand of the Father and sits down on the throne. And all the saints, those who have died and those who are still alive spiritually, are seated with Christ. If you are a follower of Jesus, you're seated with Christ at the right hand of God, and so are all the saints of the past. So before the time of Jesus, all the saints who died, they were waiting in Sheol on the side of the righteous. After Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, they are with God in paradise, in his presence, but they're still waiting for the restoration of their body in resurrection. When we die, because it's after the cross, we immediately go into the presence of God. We won't spend a time in Sheol. So again, you can do a really easy word search of Sheol, and you could do it on BibleHub.com or Blue Letter Bible, and you could just read through all the occurrences, and you'll see that both righteous people and unrighteous people, and that's not because they had necessarily a limited knowledge of what happened, but because God's redemptive work was still in progress until the full time when Jesus would be crucified. So again, that could be an entire hour. We could talk about that. But it's a really good question, and it takes time. That one sent me on a loop for the first few years of being a Christian. I always just assumed it was another word for hell, but it's not. It's a different place. Hell is, we'll get into it a different time. Great, so that's class. Thanks for those watching at home. See you guys next week for our final class. And for those of you who are here, feel free to hang out if you want for a little bit or drive home safely and wisely. Cool.